The very last pasuk in our parsha mentions that V'yeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim, be'eretz Goshen, v'ye'achazu ba, v'yifru v'yebu ma'od. On the language of v'ye'achazu ba, the word le'echoz means to grasp, to grab. Rashi says that Am Yisrael had a certain grasp of the land. The Rabbi explains in the Sicha that grasp of the land was actually on a certain level an inheritance of the land, because Parai, when Avram Avinu and Sarah went down to Mitzrayim, Parai actually gave Eretz Goshen to Sarah, so that Am Yisrael has a certain Yerusha, a certain inheritance and connection to the land of Goshen. The Medrash says something completely different. The Medrash says the Lashon Achuzah, Lechoz, is that we were, so to speak, held captive there. Lechoz, that we were Achuz, we were held captive in that land, which represents the notion of the Golus of Mitzrayim. In general, we obviously have to relate our pasuk to the basic prophecy that Avram Avinu had, where Avram Avinu was told that his children would be in a land, asher lo lahem, that's not theirs, for 400 years. Now, the 400 years, etc., that's all a function of a certain accounting, a certain cheshbon that can be understood relative to different explanations for the birth of Yitzhak, etc. But they're supposed to be in a land that's not theirs. Well, according to Rashi, if it's on a certain level a land that we inherited and had a very tight connection to, so then why exactly is it a land that's not theirs? And of course, on a deeper level, why indeed is this land, and does this land have anything to do with the idea of golus, the idea of going into a place that's very much not ours and experiencing a certain descent that was for the purpose of an ascent, ultimately the geula, Yetzias Mitzrayim, getting back out of Mitzrayim to Eretz Yisrael. So how does Rashi's pshat relate to that idea? And of course, we see that Rashi's pshat seems to be very, very different than the Medrash in general. The Rabbi is very careful to make sure that we understand that all different explanations of the same verse in the Torah must have some connection one to the other, whereas these two seem to be very, very opposite one the other. In a lengthy Sicha, the Rabbi explains that in this problem regarding the language of achuzah, in that itself we see the true meaning and the true depth of what Golus is really all about. On one hand, Golus is definitely a descent to a lower level of reality. And as much as Am Yisrael has a certain connection to Eretz Goshen, to the extent that Paro gave it to Sarah, and it can be understood as our Yerusha and our Achuzah, still, it's not Eretz Yisrael. It's not the place that HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks upon from moment to moment, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. It's not Eretz Yisrael, as much as it might not be a place of negativity. And interestingly enough, at the beginning of our sojourn in Mitzrayim, it was in no way, shape, or form negative. And we expressed the hard work of Golus through the hard work of very, very serious spiritual work of learning Torah and doing mitzvahs, and in that way we express the avodah kasha, the difficult work, in a positive spiritual way. After the passing of Yaakov and his children, so then our time in Mitzrayim took on a completely different character, and it became a time of slavery, a time of tremendous pain, a time of avodah kasha, of difficult work in gashmias and physicality. That is very much the idea of being held captive, because Golus has both of these aspects to it. On one hand, the panemius of Golus, the inner meaning of Golus, is it's simply that state that's necessary to bring about the more positive state, that state being Geula. And that's the, so to speak, positive aspect of Golus. But of course, in a revealed sense, Golus is a time of tremendous pain and affliction. And so, on one hand, Golus is ultimately about the Yerusha. It's about the ultimate inheritance, that we go into Golus to elevate the sparks that exist there and somehow take ownership of a certain aspect of the place that we are, to elevate it to a state of Kedusha and bring it back to Eretz Yisrael. There's that aspect of the Achuzah, but there's also the fact that we're held captive. And that captivity is the external expression of Golus. There's no question that we're held in captivity. But in that captivity, we always have to understand that there's also the Pneumius of Golus. There's that aspect of Golus where we're involved in something that ultimately produces positive results. In the second Sicha that's being learned this week, in the Sicha that talks about Asara Bteves, also in the 15th Chelek of Likutei Sichas, so the Rabbi explains a very interesting aspect of these fast days. Asara Bteves being the first of 4 fast days which commemorate the destruction of the temple. In the Rambam discusses regarding these 4 fast days that they will be transformed into days of joy and gladness of heart, sasan and simcha. Not only does the Rambam mention this, but this is brought also in the Torah and in Shulchan Aruch. The Rabbi asks a very, very interesting question. In addition to dealing with this at great length and with tremendous clarification, the Rabbi asks a question regarding the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. It's understandable that the Rambam would mention that these fast days are turned into days of joy, or ultimately days of joy. And it's not just that they stop being fast days, they ultimately are transformed into times of joy. And not only the days, but actually the fast itself becomes an expression of joy. In the second period of Yemei Mashiach, as the Rabbi explains at great length in the Sicha. But why is it, the Rabbi asks, that Torah and Shulchan Aruch mention in their books, which are halachic books, and don't include halachas of Yemei Mashiach like the Rambam, why do they include in their books also the mention that these fast days will turn into days of sasan and simcha, days of joy? Again, in the Rambam, that's understandable because the Rambam also includes Hilchos Mashiach in his book. But the Torah and Beis Yosef and the Torah and Shulchan Aruch do not include the laws of Yemei Mashiach. As a matter of fact, many of the laws that will be relevant in the times of Mashiach are not discussed at all in Torah and Shulchan Aruch. The laws of tithing, etc., that are relevant to Eretz Yisrael. So why would they mention this about these fast days? The Rabbi says something absolutely fascinating. It's true that they don't talk about the days of Mashiach, but they want us to understand how to relate to the fast day even in the days of Golus. That the panemius of the fast day, the true character of the fast day, as much as in the days of Golus it's a day of affliction because we're fasting and it's not particularly enjoyable, but the true nature of that day is that it commemorates both a day that will be a day of joy, because in the times of Mashiach, these will be days of joy, but the fast itself also ultimately is an expression of joy, because the fast itself is connected to the geula that arises from the Golus. Because just as in our Sicha, relative to the notion of the Achuzah, we learn that the panemius of the Golus, the inner meaning of Golus, is to ultimately bring about the geula. It's to bring about an elevation of the reality of Golus to bring the geula. So too the fast. The true meaning of the fast is it's really a celebration of geula. And when we enter into the fast with that understanding, even though we're talking about the fast that we're doing in Golus, the fast takes on a completely different character. And the tshuva of the fast day takes upon itself a completely different character. This is in line with what the Rebbe teaches us about the relationship between Golus and Geula, that how do we transform the Goyla, the Golus, into Geula? There's only one letter missing from the word Goyla to transform it into Geula, and that's the Aleph. And the Aleph represents Alufer Shalolam, HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. When we bring into the Golus a revelation of godliness, the revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we transform the Golus into Geula. And in both Sichas, we see very, very clearly the external reality of the Golus, that we're held captive, we're fasting, but the internal reality of the Golus, that it's really simply a veneer, and the panemius of the Golus is the geula that sprouts from it. So the fast day on one hand can be joyful, because we understand that the fast day is simply the means to get from the Golus to the geula. And the achuza, the being held captive, is ultimately a precursor for the achuza, the yerusha, the inheritance, the elevation of the reality of Golus to Geula, the imposition and the revelation of the Aleph in Geula to produce Geula, the revelation of godliness in the world at large. That's very much based on what we do and how we relate to the reality of Golus. And as we learned last week, only our bodies are in Golus and not our souls. And therefore we have the possibility to transform the Golus into Geula. It should happen speedily in our days.